Thank you so much, Tony, for accepting to do this conversation. It's great to see you again and to continue. Have this ongoing, conversation with you, which we started about 2 years ago. Before we talk about what you're going to do with Piccadilly, I want to kind of go back a little bit to the beginning, because of course what you do has to do with text, with music, with cultural context, and you once told me that you want to offer a rich set of relationship between the text, the music, the cultural context, and then it's also got to actually, in that sense, allow people to ways actually of thinking about commonplace things and give ideas, as you said, an effective charge and linkage to the body. So that's of course something people soon in London are going to experience at Piccadilly with your work. I just wanted to find out how you came to this work, how you had the epiphany of actually creating this extraordinary relationship between text, music, cultural context, because you started out, as we spoke earlier, initially as a sculptor. Can you tell us a little bit about how this all happened, if there was an epiphany?
I wouldn't say it was an epiphany. It was more a kind of long series of processes. I think, my education was kind of varied and weird. I really didn't think of myself as an artist, at least when I, started college. But I was involved in, creative practices and thinking about them. And I kind of moved from one place to another. I started out in a kind of traditional film and television program and found that that was not really what I ultimately wanted to do. I knew some artists, when I was in school, and I thought, well, maybe there are some possibilities of modes of practice. I was kind of generally interested in creative cultures, but, I like I said, I didn't really consider that that would be something that I would wind up doing. And then, I started doing like still photography, and I always wanted to incorporate writing, and that seemed to be a problem and issue. Although for me, looking at it through a kind of mediatic lens of, what was available at the time, it just seemed, kind of logical to want to combine, different modes of practice and different contexts for practice and different audiences for practice. It seemed like they were commonplace abroad in the culture. I even, once took a course that tried to examine visual art and those activities in relationship to, advertising, documentary practices, other forms other than fine art forms, and the kind of idea that photography in particular, didn't really privilege fine art. It was one of many things that one could do, and so I became really interested in that, and of course, became interested in ways in which texts often inflect our viewpoint on imagery and ideas about what contexts were or what audiences were, informed, the ways in which things were related to each other, and the different apportionments of those elements. And so those were really kind of exciting ideas for me. And so it was kind of almost and then I took a kind of long detour through a multiplicity of practices to get where I eventually wound up, which was, at least then, in sculpture. And basically because sculpture seemed to be the most accommodating area, at least at the place that I went to school. Other people were like interested in my ideas, but it was kind of like, yeah, but you'll need to produce a particular class of object. And it was like, well, at the time I was like, I'm not sure whether I want to commit to doing that. I'm much more interested in kind of like the spaces in between, or the folds between different modalities, rather than, identifying, with a medium, which later, I don't know, came to an interesting conclusion, because people would, for a while ago, maybe a little over a decade ago, people asked me, well, what's your relationship to video? And it's sort of like, well, in some ways, it's allowed me to process and foreground different elements that I was interested in. I wasn't really so much interested in video per se. I guess that's maybe a bit of a hangover too from, in reaction to my education, where people seem to be still obsessed with, what medium was this? It's sort of like I was more interested in the, possibilities and potential confusions of what this, thing might be. And that, I think, to some extent does inform my interest in the ability of media to kind of function for and maybe even produce publics and audiences. And, people may not need to know anything about art or the art world in order to encounter the work, or at least that's, the way I approach it. We'll see, in the case of Piccadilly, how it reads, or, if it
And
reads.
that brings us then to Piccadilly, because you are working as we speak in January 2021 for this project, actually 4 Voices, 4 Weeks. It's for video commissions, and the work will change actually throughout the months of February, every week. Can you tell me a little bit how you structured this work? Because it's in a way, of course, possible to kind of structure these months in days, or for example, Karen Smith worked on these daily, basically handwritten notes and text, and then inserted the films in a different rhythm. But with you, it's got to do with the rhythm of the week. And of course, these 4 video works, each for a week, will then also be screened digitally on the Circa platform, right, where each week you actually will speak with a different voice to then create additional content. Can you tell us a little bit about how you structure your months?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess I was aware that people were working on a kind of daily modality, and I said, well, I could do something like that, but the way I work, I tend to, work through things and relatively slowly, even though this was probably done from start to finish in maybe 3 months. And I thought, well, how else could one divide the time? And I kind of liked the simplicity of it being, set up in kind of weekly installments. And obviously there'll be other things for the website, previous work, sketches for the works. But I kind of like the idea that, repetition might be a interesting possibility, especially given the relative brevity of the, I think it was 2.5 minutes. And I was like, well, it might be interesting to have multiple scales inside of that. And so I thought it would be useful and allow people multiple sort of possibilities of catching it, or just to commit to it as a kind of period of time in a social space, as opposed to, each day having to be, different content. I like to work with repetition and already existing structures. And so it was almost as though, okay, a lot of people have taken a daily approach. I think I'll take a weekly approach. It also, there was a kind of interesting kind of symmetry to it. February happens to have 4 weeks. And so it was kind of, well, it'd be interesting to do a different, thing each week and think about maybe the relationships between the 4 pieces over a kind of different time scale than the daily. Yeah, it's funny. I think with me, it would probably be easier to think about like a weekly kind of thing than doing something every day. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I know some people, it's almost kind of a really interesting structural discipline. But for me, it was more, I guess I went to my repertoire of things that I've been thinking about and then said, well, how can I set up a relationship, again, between and a structure to go through. And I guess I had some questions and issues and different ways of maybe constituting a relationship between the text and the music in each case. And I thought, yeah, these are, 4 ideas that I've been thinking about, and I think there are a relationship between them. And so would it be interesting to try to lay them out in a particular, pattern with kind of known and unknown differences and correspondences between them.
So Tony, I wanted to ask you about anger is an energy, and what prompted the decision to produce a work based on anger is an energy. And I was also curious about the connection actually to the most recent work you've shown in London, which is in your Goldsmith exhibition, which was a survey, but included also new work. It included a work based on a lecture by Kodwo Eshun about Mark Fisher, and then a piece called The Morrissey Problem, which, as you said, addressed questions around nationalism in recent statement. And we can find such statements also by John Lydon. So I was wondering if there is a connection actually to this previous film, The Morrissey Problem.
Let me start with like how the piece began. I've often said in talks, for instance, that I often make work out of things that really bother me or things that intrigue me and that have a kind of ongoing and sustaining value. And about a year ago, I actually did a talk in Manchester at the Whitworth. And afterwards, a young woman, student, I believe, had a question about the relationship between anger and my practice. And so that actually started me thinking about, ideas and models. And somehow, I think in many ways, the song Rise of P.I.L's came into mind because he literally does use that phrase as part of the chorus. And I was like, well, to some extent that's true for me, but also at the same time, I was also very, very hyper aware of this growing, turn towards nationalism. And so I thought it might be interesting to take up, his description of what his, influences were, what that situation was that led to the production of that particular song, but also with an eye to the ways in which, one could say that those desires for change, for instance, that I think were encoded in punk and post-punk, have now become kind of rallying cries for, what I would consider to be undesirable nationalisms or rampant capitalism or any number of things. So it's almost as though one could say that I went from, yeah, that's part of maybe my ethos and my thinking and my own personal history. But on the other hand, these things have had more complicated repercussions and results. And yet at the same time, I thought it was interesting to kind of look back on that and maybe to contextualize it with other things and juxtapose it with other things in the other works in this series. So it was kind of an interesting beginning point because in a way it I think figures, an origin or influences, but on the other hand, it's also more complicated. And I'm glad you actually pulled out the Morrissey question because in some ways that same relationship applies in a certain sense that, people have taken different positions than perhaps they began with. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which, certain even popular music discourses have begun to figure in explicit political discourses. A kind of minor subset of this is that one of the things I've been thinking about in other projects are the uses of popular music in political campaigns these days and how, I think they do in a kind of generalization, of course. Some want to position themselves as optimistic in, cultural terms and inclusive. And it's interesting to notice that others want to position things as being deeply conflicted and you could even argue against togetherness, even as they use popular music, they seem to, be a kind of isolationist, if you will, in their desire and intent. Maybe at some point I'll actually do a work explicitly about that. But in relation to the other project that I'm working on right now is a kind of way of thinking through in that instance, the question of, lies and liars in popular music. And I, juxtaposed an article basically about the lack of perception on the part of the Trump administration on COVID with these songs about lies or liars. And so it's like, and that led me to actually look at things like playlists for the Trump campaign and think, well, maybe there's something there as well. This particular sort of selection of popular music as juxtaposed with maybe another, selection that one might make that would articulate maybe a different kind of view on society.
Yeah, that's why I think this quote of Ethel, is so great. The world needs togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, a common future, not isolation. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the relations between text and music, between reading, hearing, listening. In your conversation with Kodwo Eshom, Kodwo basically talks about this idea of you engaging with listening in the mode of looking in the key of reading, reading in the mode of watching in the key of hearing. So I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit how that works in relation to the Circa piece, and also how you work through possible affective harmony or dissonance.
Yeah, I think for me, it's almost as though sound is a kind of compositional device. And I use the, patterns of refrain or chorus, verse chorus, as one kind of template that I know will be kind of exceeded and complicated by the verbal aspects of the pieces. I often try to have a gap or maybe multiple gaps between the sound material and the text. In that, I often, but not always, choose music from a different time period than the text, mainly because I think that there are certain maybe historical and cultural problematics that are constantly being worked on, if you will, in popular forms. People sort of assume that, there's only the pleasure that they find in the music, but then I think there are always other things that could be made legible in a certain way. And I think in my case, I seek to juxtapose things in such a way to bring them into a kind of tension. Sometimes maybe a contradiction, maybe sometimes there's a kind of a differential sort of emotion or subject matter that kind of rubs against or complicates the text. I mean, I tend to work with fairly serious textual subject matters, and I think having the um, intensification and release, say, of a pop song kind of contradicts that or kind of engages, the body in a certain way. Like people often, ask, should I be tapping my foot to this? Or can I dance to this? And I think that's an interesting question that one can provoke through juxtaposition with language. Um, I think that there's a kind of productivity and interference that's useful in putting these things together in certain ways. I try to not super specify things, but try to locate areas where there might be complication and friction that might be, I think, useful to viewers, making possible differential readings of the text, um, different kinds of relations, different kinds of attention that are possible through the juxtaposition. I mean, I've said from time to time that, what I consider to be a kind of quintessential modern experience is reading something while listening to music while, say, watching a landscape. And I try to take that as a kind of approach to the materials. And I feel that, on a certain level, if people feel like there's too much interference or too much complication, the texts already exist. They're not difficult to locate. I usually say what the sources are at the end of the piece, if, sort of like if they really, if they want to know what this thing said. Of course, there's an interesting little bit of complication to that in the pieces that I did for Circa, in that I actually encode the pieces. And so the text in the pieces. And so that maybe adds another maybe layer of distance, but also maybe a kind of, a weird kind of intentionality and intensity to it, because you're not only, reading it, you're also kind of having to decode it in a certain way. And I think we can maybe talk about this later. In some instances, I think it works maybe better than others in terms of text to encode, because one of the texts is unencoded, and I encoded it, and I looked at it, and it was almost as though it was even difficult for me to tell what the reference was. And I thought, well, maybe this is almost too extreme. But it's interesting that for the others, maybe because the vocabulary was different and maybe less, specific, that they were actually easier to make out. And I kind of like the idea of, using a large scale, a very, very public space, if you will, to deliver, you could say, a coded message in the way that subcultures exist, and and reuse elements of popular culture to make statements or to comment on the complexity of their location and identity within culture. And so those were the kinds of things that I was thinking about for the project.
I wanted to ask you also about the sound, actually, the sonic component. It's the Notwist, a German indie rock band, a band which was formed in 1989. It's the year of the Berlin Wall coming down. It's the year of the GPS being invented. It's also the year, of course, of Tim Berners-Lee inventing the World Wide Web. And I've just had a conversation with him recently where we talked about not only his invention of the World Wide Web, but also, of course, his concern that net neutrality is in danger. Because, of course, the idea was always that this would be for everyone. As he said famously in his quote, this is for everyone. And he's very concerned that, of course, the World Wide Web, there is sort of a faster internet for people who pay and a slower internet for people who can't pay. And so he's on a crusade, really, to sort of maintain net neutrality. Anyway, so this is all 1989, and 1989 is the year when the Acker brothers and Messerschmitt actually formed this group, the Notwist, in a small place called Weilheim in Oberbayern in Bavaria. And it's actually only in 1990 that then they recorded their first debut album. It's very grunge metal.
Yeah.
And then in 92 they did Nuke, which is more sort of an indie album, one can say. And we spoke about this before in our previous interview about your interest in this Bavarian group, in the Notwist. So I wanted to ask you in general what interests you about the Notwist, and then what prompted you to actually bring the Notwist into Piccadilly.
Yeah. I have a long-standing interest in their music. I was introduced to their music actually, kind of towards the middle, not at the beginning, by a friend and former student who knew about their work. And I think he gave me one of the later albums. I'm trying to think of which one. Shrink, actually, from, I think, 97. And I must admit, it caused a kind of brainwave and upheaval for me, because it was one of those things where it was one of those uncanny experiences where it's like, why have I not heard this before? And what is it that, I thought I knew before I listened to this that I feel like I was missing for a very, very long time? I was kind of interested in a number of different things. I think especially in Shrink, that they kind of went from different genres, almost like within a maybe even single song, or from song to song, the genre shifted in ways that were interesting to me. There were, horn arrangements, like, some jazz things, some electronic bleep kinds of things going on. But then there were these, songs. Then there were these, kind of more indie rock songs and kind of noise music moments. And I think it was the range of both affects and techniques that really initially intrigued me. It was like, wow, I don't know anybody, or I couldn't think of anybody at the time who did such a range of musics in, a kind of a particular group setting. And I think maybe that lack of overarching genre really appealed to me. I think it maybe says something about, my own practice and my kind of wide interest in music and otherwise. I was also interested, in their history, that they worked in a small town and yet, you know, started out in this kind of post-punk, hardcore, grunge context. And then, you know, 10 years later, they're doing something that one wouldn't necessarily connect to that as a kind of point of origin, you know, and that also intrigued me. I also met them in 2000, in the summer of 2000, because I decided that I would like to ask them if I could use their music in a project, and I did. The project is kind of still in kind of tatters, but some of the works were actually the first works in my Evil series. And as that series sort of developed, they kind of return as a kind of musical accompaniment for different episodes of that. And, you know, I've been in dialogue with Marcus Acker pretty much, you know, for 20 years. And it's interesting to think about, you know, their location, their practice, changes in the world. You know, for instance, I don't know whether we would have been in conversation and had been allowed to meet had it not been for the internet. So it's kind of, you know, these are weird things that happen. You know, people who are interested in something talk to a friend and they say, oh yes, write him. I think he might be interested in talking to you. And you start up a, you know, working and thinking relationship. I think because I knew their origins in, you know, post-punk, grunge, bits of metal, I thought it might be interesting to take one of their more contemporary songs. That song is from Casino, is from, I think, 2014. And I think, you know, I often look at things in kind of oblique ways or as, you know, somewhat allegorical for other things. And I think the Casino, to some extent, is also, you could read as a bit of an allegory about their position as musicians in a particular, you know, categorized, you could say, music marketplace, and the, you know, desires to get through the day and to function in, you know, a context that kind of works against some of your, you know, you could argue, guiding principles. And I thought it might be an interesting way to, after, you know, evoking maybe one song, to respond to it with something from a different time, a different genre, and a different location. So that's kind of, you know, the way I thought about it. I can't remember the rest of your question components. I mean, I think there's also.
No, I think that answers it very well already, you know, because it was just about Notwist, and maybe just, you know, a little bit more about why Notwist for Piccadilly and the connection to John Lydon. I mean, I'm not sure if you have to go into detail with that, but that was somehow the last part of the question. I mean, you've already explained it, but maybe you can add a bit on that.
I mean, I know that they have fans in the UK. I know that they've played there probably more often than they have in the US, which is another thing. And so in some ways, I think it was a place, you know, in some ways, maybe thinking about places to start a discourse around, you know, where things are today and that strange conundrum between, how should I put it, anger, the desire for maybe peaceful ways of addressing cultural change, to horrific incidents still happening, and maybe to think about, you know, what they mean in a kind of larger and more public scale, that I thought it might be an interesting place to begin, you know, something that doesn't necessarily seem to be about those things in any direct way, but that might, in juxtaposition, constitute a kind of meaningful and useful glimpse into that, you know, series of relations that we're constantly, I think, dealing with, especially these days.
Tony, you're interested in the question if anger is posited as the only avenue to change. And I actually spoke last week, I had a long conversation with the amazing Honey Dijon, and we talked about many different aspects of, you know, it was interesting in relation also to your work about this idea of a tradition of bricolage, of bringing things together, of bringing harmonic chaos together to actually do something new. And but we talked a lot with Honey Dijon also about love, no, about music as a healing. So it would be great to hear a little bit about that.
Okay. I mean, I think that it does bring people into relation in an interesting way that may not be possible, strictly speaking, discursively. And that sort of, that possibility interests me. I think it is a way of kind of engaging people. I think it's interesting. I think, who is it? Jacques Attali says something to the effect that music is a way of processing violence, and that it does so in ways that make it possible to have some kind of social space that is not, strictly speaking, always about like competition for the same things. And that it kind of rehearses maybe a series of possibilities for ways to be in the world with others. From, playing ensembles to listening, to music collectively. And that is often a very restorative and useful set of possibilities that, may reduce our desire to be constantly, confronting one another. I think, too, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, and I don't know if it's directly related to what you're thinking, is that it is a space for people to be together. And that is something that, at least for my friends who are interested in music as a cultural force, something that is not, in great supply today. And, people are, I think a number of people are really concerned about just that lack of time and contact with others. I've gotten a lot of reports and feedback of people, let's say, dancing in my exhibitions. And it's sort of like, well, why would that be? And it's almost because clubs are closed. And so it's like you go to a location that's supposed to be about visual and media art, but music is there, and therefore a different kind of address is possible just through that. But maybe in the broader sense, I think it also is something that can bring people into kind of affective resonance and move them away from, other sort of possibilities of relation and conflict. Not that it's a panacea, because, nothing is, but that it is a way of, like I say, processing, in this case, great traumas and functioning in the world on a daily basis. And that's important to me. Let's put it, that simply.
Such an important point. Thank you. Now, also the address in this work you create for Piccadilly, for Circa, feels individuated. I was wondering if that is something which will continue also with the second film, with the third film, with the fourth film?
I would probably argue that there's a movement maybe towards a greater, well, maybe it comes and goes. But I think, Lydon's text is, positioned in a particular way. I mean, he's basically describing his own practice and his reaction to certain historical and contextual elements in the making of this one song. And of course, there's, a kind of single voice in the music that is also kind of articulating a story. After that, I think it becomes a little, maybe a bit more complicated as to, who's saying what and in what voice. I kind of immediately went to contradict that maybe a bit in the second piece, which features kind of two different versions of, you could say, related narrations from John Lewis, the US senator and activist. And I think maybe I, sort of wanted to move away from the individual who may be angry or who may be trying to analyze the social and cultural situation in which they find themselves, to something that maybe moves both more to a historical modality, but also to a strangely very contemporary one, and one that, you know, has an explicit stake in society, you know, as, you know, part of what they seek to articulate. It was almost a little bit of an accident. I was thinking of working with the John Lewis text. I was kind of intrigued by the idea of writing something for publication after one's death explicitly, you know, having that as part of, you know, the context in which it's meant to be read. And so it was interesting to me to then juxtapose that with something that's retrospective, but also from an earlier source. And so it's sort of like he's thinking about his life in a kind of almost final aspect. And then there's something that's actually more of a kind of movement backwards in a certain sense. Whereas the other text is actually, or at least the excerpt that I chose, maybe more specifically about his response to the Black Lives Matter movement in particular. And, you know, this kind of thing at the end of my life, I see something that also resonates with, you know, what my life has been up to that point. And so there's a kind of maybe more of a desire for continuity and connection in the second piece. And then I kind of maybe double it and maybe complicate that a little bit in the soundtrack. It was one of those things too, where I was, you know, thinking about what music I was going to use for the text. And then, you know, I actually happened across, I think, an email announcement from a friend and someone whose music I've actually used in other pieces. And it was like, well, how did he know that I was thinking about John Lewis? Because this was the thing, you know, that used a quote from John Lewis. And I was like, now, normally I wouldn't necessarily do that. You know, I would try to maybe use, you know, things more distant in a way. But then I thought it was really interesting to have something that was obviously from a different time, or, you know, from a different time, you know, a different place in juxtaposition. I don't know whether I've ever actually done that before. But it was something that seemed to make sense. And then, yeah, the question of love and your relationship with both family and with society are things that he talks about in the music track. So, yeah, something maybe more generous and more porous, and not so much about, you know, one individual perhaps working, you know, in isolation, but, you know, individuals seeking to activate, you know, relations with others.
In one of your texts, you say, I'm not trying to build a rational argument. I'm attempting to set up a series of relations. And you compare actually your role as an artist also as an editor. Can you talk a little bit about this, about the artist as an editor?
I think it probably, you know, in terms of maybe historical and theoretical references, it's, I see it in relation maybe to two things that people, in my view, it's almost as though each text has differential readings, and I'm just looking for readings that resonate maybe for me, and hopes that they might register in different ways for others. And I kind of like the idea that often, you know, I probably in a similar context said something like, I don't see myself as a traditional author. In some respects, writing is relatively difficult for me, but seeing possibilities in fragments of other texts is something that seems to register for me, and something that I feel that I can do relatively easily. And I try, you know, I think when I started working, say, with archival images, it was always a question of trying to find a space for a reading that comported with maybe what my desires were. And they were not always directly things that are going to be central to the material that I'm looking at, that sometimes I'm actually looking for marginal things that refer to questions that I'm interested in. And I think that to some extent does inform my approach to text. I'm kind of looking for fragments and juxtapositions of fragments that maybe throw into relief certain questions. And that, you know, it's not a question of like, although sometimes I do attempt to take all of something and code it or, you know, add things to it in such a way as that it enunciates in a radically different or, you know, more fragmented way. But often as not, I'm trying to take bits and juxtapose them in ways that are productive, at least for me first, and then, you know, hopefully they have, you know, resonances for others, as opposed to, you know, having a kind of specified, you know, I tend to work with methods, you know, filters, if you will, but I'm more interested in what, you know, happens as things get processed than I am necessarily in knowing before I start what it, you know, what it will turn out to be. But that being said, I use, you know, kind of structural methods to get to that, if you will. I think, you know, there is a way in which choices one makes can be productive, as opposed to thinking that one has to always be originary. You know, I think when I was a student, I was beginning to question, you know, whether it was necessary for things to be original in order for them to have resonance or legibility or weight, that it might be possible to take fragments and juxtapose them in such a way with other elements that they produce, yeah, new effects, even if they're not new materials, if you will.
I wanted to ask you, Tony, about your unrealized projects, because as you know, I'm very interested in this idea of unrealized projects of artists, because we know very little finally about artists' unrealized projects. We know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them very frequently through the competition, also architectural competition. But it's very unknown most of the time what artists really would like to do. And artists are invited a lot to exhibitions, to all kinds of projects, but too seldomly artists are actually asked what they really would like to do. What's the projects that cannot happen, you know, within the framework of institutions. And I think it's important to talk about these unrealized projects to somehow help make them happen, to facilitate maybe their realization. Now, the range of unrealized projects is very wide. There are the projects which are too big to be realized, too small to be realized, too expensive to be realized. There are the projects which are utopic. There are the projects which are unrealizable. There are the dreams. There are also projects which are forgotten in the studio. I mean, we all have projects, I suppose, we somehow on the way, on the path, forgot about. Then there are the projects which are partially realized, as Vito Acconci once pointed out to me. Then there are the projects which are censored. Then another category would be, as Doris Lessing pointed out to me, the projects we haven't dared to do. That's a form of, Doris Lessing called it self-censorship. So within these, and there are many more, but within these different possibilities of unrealized projects, I was wondering if you could tell us about one or two of your unrealized projects you somehow hope to realize.
Yeah, that's difficult, Hans Ulrich, because one of my unrealized projects is something that we actually began a conversation about, and then I did realize part of it. And so I think I would like to continue my research on the question of like how artists function in society in relationship to like practices as a kind of social model, as a motor for so-called innovation and gentrification, all of those things. And so I'm started on that, thanks to you in some small part. If I were to say another thing that I've been thinking about is, and I don't know if I will realize it, at one point I thought about doing, because I often only use small bits or one article of something, I've thought about doing a kind of massive book length project, and now I'm thinking maybe in terms of just to keep things in check, that, you know, I might do a series of them. And one text that I'm looking at with regard to that, and I'm hoping to make some headway on it, and maybe I'll do it, you know, as I often do things, in chapters or discrete formations.
Yeah.
But I've been thinking a lot since we mentioned the Kodro Eshon text on Mark Fisher. I've been thinking about doing an aspect or aspects of capitalist realism, which I think is a really useful and intriguing book. And I don't know how I would approach it other than I have some ideas for what the soundtrack would be. But, you know, how much of it one would be able to translate into, and what kind of space in, you know, which it would exist, are things that I would really need to spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out for myself. So you know, it's interesting. It's like, when I think about unrealized projects, I often think about things that I would really like to do, and in some cases have had some people say, "Oh, don't do that," you know. I don't, yeah, and there is a kind of like, well, why not? Or if it fails, you know, what difference does it make? In a certain sense, it might be worth doing, even if it, you know, is unsatisfactory, you know, for a number of reasons. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. It's almost like things I would like to do where, you know, people would sort of say, maybe, you know, it's sort of like, it's too, you know, it's too big, or it's too small, or, you know, there are those kinds of, if you will, imaginings, you know, about what the scale is or should be or could be. And it's sort of like, well, you know, there's a part of me that I wish I just had the quote unquote time to figure out, you know, how impractical or how utopic or how, you know, failure prone it might be.
Thank you so much for this amazing interview. It was really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks
See
again
you
for your
soon.
time.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.
Circa offers a very important platform.
It's really just asking us to pause in this moment.
Art can be a form of disruption when it appears on such a exposed place as the Piccadilly advertising screen. Hi, it's Hans.
My wish would really be that we could find it in our mind and hearts to really work as one people.
Public art right now can only be important if it supports your community.
See Your Name in Lights is our fundraising initiative to challenge this model of only having kind of, you know, rich 1% funding and supporting the arts.